This time we're supposed to separate R3 from this formula. Okay, so what I'm going to do first, I'm going to add all fractions which are on the left side of the equal sign. Okay, now in order to add fractions, we're supposed to find a common denominator. Common denominator for R1, R2, R3 is going to be R1, R2, R3. Okay, so I'm going to have three fractions with the common denominator R1, R2, R3, R1, R2, R3, R1, R2, R3. Everything is equal 1 over R. Now, I multiply the denominator of first fraction R1 by R2, R3. Whatever I did in the denominator, I have to do also in the numerator. 1 times R2, R3 is R2, R3. Second fraction, right, had R2 in the denominator. I multiply that denominator by R1, R3. Whatever I did in the denominator, I have to also do in the numerator. So I'm going to have R1, R3, because R1, R3 times 1 is R1, R3. The third denominator, I multiply by R1, R2. R1 times R2 times 1 is R1, R2. Okay, remember, whatever I did in the denominator, I have to do also in the numerator. Okay, now let's take a look what I'm going to have right now. I have common denominator, I can add numerators. That's why I'm going to have R2, R3 plus R1, R3 plus R1, R2 over R1, R2, R3 equals 1 over R. Now we can solve the proportion. Okay? Remember, anytime we have two fractions, one of them is on the left side of the equal sign, another is on the right side, this is proportion. Now, in order to solve the proportion, we're supposed to use the cross multiplication. Okay? So I'm going to multiply by R my parentheses. Okay? So I'm going to have R times R2, R3 plus R1, R3 plus R1, R2 equals R1, R2, R3 times 1, which is R1, R2, R3. Now I have R3 over here, and over here. In order to pull out R3 from the parentheses, I have to eliminate the parentheses. How I can do that? By simply distributing this R into every single term inside of the parentheses. Okay, this is multiplication, so I have to multiply R by every single term. Okay, so that's why I'm going to have R, R2, R3 plus R, R1, R3 plus R, R1, R2 equals R1, R2, R3. Next, I have to collect all R3 terms on one side. Okay? In order to save some work, okay, I'm going to copy these two terms because they have R3 to the right side. Okay, I'm going to take these two, okay, and I'm going to move them to the right. Now, so I'm going to have R, I have to copy this term down, R, R1, R2 equals R1, R2, R3 minus R, R2, R3 minus R, R1, R3. Let me remind you that anytime you move any term from one side to the other, when at least one of the other terms stays at the original position, you have to change the sign, always. Next, you're supposed to realize that we have R3 over here, R3 over here, and R3 over here. We can factorize that R3. So I'm going to have R1, R2 equals, factorize R3, so I have R3, and I'm going to have R1, R2 minus R2 minus R1. Okay? I do not want to have anything multiplied to R3. Okay? So I have to eliminate these parentheses from R. How I can eliminate multiplication? By simply dividing both sides equation by whatever is next to R3. Okay? So I'm going to end up with, and I'm going to go straight to the final solution, R3 is going to be equal R1, R2 over, okay, whatever was inside of the parentheses. So I'm going to have R1, R2 minus R2 minus R1. This is the solution to my problem.